This video is about what you can do if you find that your pottery, which is in a bone dry state, has cracked whilst it's in the drying process. You can see that this piece of slab pottery has cracked in a couple of places. It's cracked along the top edge and also in the corner. I'm going to use a different method to fix each of the two cracks. The first method involves using something called paper clay slip, and the second method involves using something called spooze and magic water. They're all very easy to make and I'll show you how to do all of them. If you find this video helpful, please do give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so that you know when I've uploaded a new video. And with that said, let's get into it. Here are some of the tools that it would be helpful to have to fix your clay. It's good to have a little selection of soft paint brushes and also some sharp modelling tools. This one here is a sculpting tool with two sharp ends. It's quite a good thing to be able to scratch into the clay with, but if you don't have one of those then you can use a needle tool and some wooden modelling tools too. And this is how I make paper clay slip. You're going to need some bone dry clay that's made out of the same clay that you made your pottery out of. You're going to need some white vinegar, some toilet paper and a stick blender. I originally found this recipe when I watched a video by a potter called Martha Grover who described how you make it, and I've been using it ever since. It's great for making very strong joints and also repairing clay. So first of all, I pour out about a cup of white vinegar into a container, and then what I would recommend is pouring that vinegar into a container with reasonably tall sides, because what I find is that when I use the stick blender in the vinegar, if it's not in a tall walled pot, then it just splatters all over the place. So transfer it into a tall walled pot. And then add some sheets of toilet paper. I would suggest adding about 4 or 5 sheets of toilet paper. Just tear it up and put it into the container with the vinegar. And then using the stick blender, just give it a bit of a whiz to create a bit of a sort of a pulpy, fibrous liquid from the vinegar and the paper. Then what you need is some crushed up bone dry clay. I find the best way to make crushed up clay is to dry some pieces of clay out in these sort of potato chip shapes, because it dries very quickly and also it's very thin, so it crushes easily. It's fragile enough so that you can just crush it with the back of your knuckles if you put it in a plastic bag. And then once you've broken it up with your knuckles, what you can do is you can roll a rolling pin over it as well, which will break the pieces down into even smaller bits. Doesn't need to be broken down into a complete powder, but just the smaller the bits, the more easily it'll break down in the liquid that you're going to put it into. You have to use bone dry clay to do this, because if you put wet clay in a liquid like vinegar, it's just going to sit in a big lump in the vinegar. It won't dissolve, it'll just sit in a gloopy lump. But if it's bone dry, it'll dissolve very quickly in the vinegar. You have to be careful when you're handling dry clay, because clay dust, you don't want to inhale clay dust, it's bad for you. So that's why I'm crushing it in the plastic bag to keep the dust to a minimum. But also it means that you can pour the bone dry clay into the vinegar mix quite easily with the plastic bag. You just give the pulpy vinegar paper mix a bit of a stir again, and then what I do is I snip the corner off the plastic bag. Hopefully with a pair of scissors that isn't quite as blunt as the ones that I'm using. So just snip the corner off and then you can just pour it into the container, and it just keeps dust to a minimum. And if you're doing this inside, it's a good idea to wear a respirator too. So I just pour enough of the clay in so that it starts to sort of but the clay is sort of creating like little islands in the vinegar. There's enough of it so that it starts to kind of poke out of the top of the liquid, and then just give it a stir. You don't need to stir it so much that you are making the clay dissolve, because that's going to happen naturally over time anyway. So I'm just adding a little bit more now, because I know that I'm going to use this to fix a crack in some clay, so I want it to be reasonably thick. So just give it a bit of a stir. and then what I would recommend doing is just leaving it overnight so that all that clay breaks down in the vinegar, so you've got a nice smooth paste. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to fix that top crack, and the first thing to do is to take some vinegar. In that jug what I have is just some plain white vinegar, and I'm using that soft brush, and I'm just going to run the soft brush over the crack just to moisten up the clay a bit more. I don't want it to be sopping wet, but I do want the clay to be wet enough so that I can score into it. And really effectively what you're doing is you're kind of opening up the crack a little bit more so that you can then pack it with the paper clay slip, and then using one of the sharp tools like a needle tool or something like that just to scratch into the crack, sort of scratching the crack away really. And the reason vinegar works well is because it's a flocculant, which means it causes the clay particles to stick together. You can't, with bone dry clay, you can't just sort of pop a bit of regular clay slip or regular clay into a gap, because what happens is the dry clay will just suck the water out of the fresh clay really quickly, and it just kind of peels away and will flake off. So that's why you've got to go through a bit of a process just to fix it. And the paper clay slip works because the vinegar makes the clay sticky, and the paper fibres create, when it dries, the paper fibres create a sort of a strong internal structure in the clay which stops it from shrinking and really sort of bonds the clay together. So yeah, at the moment you can see what I'm doing is I'm just kind of going through a process of adding a bit of vinegar, scoring into it, creating a bit of a mush really. I mean, obviously you don't want to make it so wet that the whole thing falls apart, but you just need to create a sort of a slip kind of substance for the paper clay slip to key into. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a bit of the paper clay slip. I've loaded it onto a wooden tool, and I'm just dabbing it into the gap that's there. And what I would say with this fixing cracks in bone dry clay is there's certain things that I will try and fix, like for example if I've hand built something and it's taken a long time and I don't want to have to start from scratch again, I'll try and fix it using one of these methods. But for example, if a handle is cracked off at the joint, if I've made a mug and the handle has cracked at the joint, I wouldn't then start trying to bond the handle back on again. For me, I want to be sure with a handle on a mug or a teapot or something like that, I want to be sure that that handle is absolutely as secure as it can be, so I wouldn't want to be kind of fixing or repairing a crack on a handle, but something like this where it's kind of decorative and the process of making it's been relatively high maintenance, then I probably would at least give it a try. And one of the things that can happen when you fix a crack like this is that you might have to do it in stages. So you might apply a bit of the slip and then allow it to dry, and then you might find that the crack, depending on how big the crack was originally, you might find that the crack opens up just a little bit again whilst when the paper clay slip has dried. But that's okay. Each time it opens up, the crack is going to be just a little bit smaller, and you can just repeat the process until it's completely filled. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a go at fixing that crack in the corner with something called spooze. And here is how you make spooze. One of the first ingredients that you need is corn syrup. The recipe for spooze consists of corn syrup, vinegar and bone dry clay. And the recipe was originally by a potter called Peggy Here, and her recipe basically included having 3 parts. So 1 part corn syrup, 1 part vinegar and 1 part bone dry clay. So I'm measuring out half a cup of corn syrup there and then just transferring it into a dish, and then half a cup of white vinegar, which I'm also pouring into the dish. Give it a bit of a stir because the corn syrup is very thick and I want to kind of blend the two two liquids in together. And then I'm actually measuring out a cup of bone dry clay, even though the original recipe states 1 part corn syrup, 1 part vinegar, 1 part clay, because I'm using this to patch up a crack rather than just joining two pieces of clay together. I want it to be quite thick, I don't want it to be too runny, so I'm just using double the amount of clay. Then pour the clay into the vinegar and corn syrup, give it a bit of a stir to make sure that all of the clay is submerged in the liquid, and then leave it overnight so that the clay breaks down. And then the next thing that you're going to want to do is make some magic water. It's very simple, it takes about 5 minutes, but it's an incredibly strong bonding agent for clay, so it's well worth the effort. First of all, what I do is I pour 1 1/3 pints of water into a plastic bottle. And then I'm just pouring a little bit of that water into a measuring jug. Doesn't matter how much goes in the measuring jug, about a cup is fine. It's really just to dissolve the other ingredients into. So I'm using 1/2 tablespoon measure of liquid sodium silicate, which is easy to get hold of. I'll put a link in the description to where you can buy some sodium silicate solution. And then a 1/4 teaspoon of soda ash, which again is easy to get hold of from a regular pottery suppliers, but again I'll put a link in the description below if you want to get hold of some of that. So it's 1/4 teaspoon goes into the water too. Give it a good stir to make sure it's all mixed together, and then pour the mixture back into the bottle, so you've got 1.1 pints of magic water. I'm not sure who it was who originally invented magic water, but the original recipe that I found involved using a gallon of water, which is just a huge amount of magic water, which I would never use. So I've just reduced the quantities down. The proportions are correct, but I just reduced the quantities down. So I'm just putting the lid on, give it a bit of a shake, and then it's a good idea to label the bottle. I don't know about you, but I often end up with jars and jugs and containers full of stuff, and after a few months I've forgotten what's in there. So just label the bottle, and there you have it. You've got some magic water. Now we're going to fix the small crack in the corner, and the technique is more or less the same as before. It's just we're using different products. I'm going to use the magic water in the same way that I used the vinegar before. I'm going to wet that area of clay and then use a sharp tool just to sort of score into it and open up the cracked area, and then pack it with the spooze that we made earlier on. The magic water acts in a different way to the vinegar. So the vinegar is a flocculant which makes the clay particles sticky and clump together, whereas the soda ash and the sodium silicate are deflocculants, which means that it makes the clay more kind of liquid rather than sticky. And also the sodium silicate contains silica, which when it's fired becomes hard and glass-like, so it creates a really strong bond. So just moisten up the clay with the magic water and then scratch into it as we did before. And then once you're ready, just get a little bit of the spooze and using a wooden tool, just daub the spooze into the gap that's been left behind from the scoring that you've done. And as with the paper clay slip, it doesn't matter if it's a little bit if the surface is a little bit untidy, because once it's dried and hardened, we're going to sand it down so that it blends in with the rest of the surface. Once I'm happy that both of the repairs have got enough slip on them, what I'm going to do is I'm going to let that second repair dry enough so that it's touch dry, and then I'm going to put it in a plastic bag just to allow it to dry out slowly. I don't want all of the moisture to evaporate from the fix too quickly, so just let it dry slowly, and then once it's dry it'll be ready for sanding. Now I'm outside now, the piece is ready to sand, and I always sand clay outside if at all possible because I want to avoid inhaling any clay dust. Now if you look carefully you can see that spooze repair has actually got a very fine hairline crack in it, which isn't uncommon. It's not uncommon for them to crack a little bit as they're drying. It's nothing to be worried about. We can fix it, and I'll show you how to do that in a minute. But just for now, we're going to get on with doing some sanding and see how they look once they've been sanded down. I sand the paper clay slip down with a green scrubby. I just snip off a small section of a green scrubby that you would use to do the dishes with, and just rub away at the slipped area until it is flush with the rest of the piece. The paper clay slip is actually pretty soft. Although it's a good strong fix for the crack in the clay. Actually, when you're sanding it down, because it's mainly paper and clay, it does sand away pretty easily. So just rubbing with a bit of scrubby is fine for now. And although that crack that was fixed with spooze has got a hairline crack in it, I am going to sand it down before I have a second go at repairing it. Sanding it down is just going to give me an idea of what needs to be redone. If you find that you are having issues with your spooze cracking, what you can do when you're combining the ingredients together is you can actually add a bit of toilet paper into the mixture. When you're mixing the vinegar and the corn syrup together, you can blend in some toilet paper too, and that'll just give it a bit of extra internal strength. So here's what the repairs look like so far. You can see the hairline crack seems to have disappeared, but actually all that's happened is that it's been filled up with clay dust. I am going to have a second go at repairing that corner crack. And actually, when you put a bit of extra magic water on the repaired area, it flushes away the clay dust. And although you can't see it on the camera because it's such a fine hairline crack, it is still there. And it does need to be fixed, because even though it's now a really small hairline crack, if it's left, it'll open up a little bit more as the clay becomes even drier, and when it's bisque fired it'll probably open up even further. So do need to have a second go at repairing it, and it's really just repeating the same process. The difference is that now I'm not really kind of digging in too much into the crack. All I'm doing is just put a bit of magic water on. I'm just going to score lightly into the area that needs repairing, just to create a bit of rough texture. And then I'm going to apply another layer of the spooze on top of the scored area. Now I'm going to have a go at sanding the second layer of dried spooze. The second layer of spooze is quite a bit harder, as in more tough and stronger than the first layer. So I'm using a piece of medium grade sandpaper to sand it down in the first instance. And you just have to be careful when you're using sandpaper that you're only sanding the area that you want to sand down, because as you know, bone dry clay is very soft and it's easy to just go a bit crazy with the sandpaper and sand areas that you don't want to sand away. So just being careful just to sand away the repaired patch. And then one last step is just to give it a little bit of a sand down with some finer grade sandpaper, just to get rid of any rough texture that might have been left behind by the medium grain sandpaper. And it's looking pretty good now. That second repair has made a difference. And then I'm just using that fine sandpaper just to go over the top repair too, just to get rid of any texture that's been left behind by the scrubby. And here are the two finished repairs, which are both looking pretty good. If you found this video helpful, do give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Keep an eye out for my next video, which is coming up any second now. Thanks for watching, bye!